The Triforce has become one of the most famous video game symbols of all time. Imagine that, putting 3 triangles together and pretty much everyone out there knows exactly where it comes from. The British 3rd Army Division, founded in 1809 by Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. Okay, yeah, Nintendo definitely wasn't the first to come up with the design, but in the world of gaming it has become synonymous with the Zelda series. But where did the inspiration for the Triforce come from? I have a particular gripe with this subject, and it's not because it's still a bit of a mystery to this day, but in fact that people pretend that it isn't. I've been wanting to do a video about the origins of the Triforce for a while now, and essentially cancelled the idea because, well, the mystery was already solved, or so I was led to believe. But after a bit of digging, you quickly realize that Nintendo has never outright confirmed anything when it comes to where they got the idea from. The conclusion presented is simply a best guess and not a solid fact at all. A very good best guess, mind you, but I've always felt there was something missing. So before we get into what the main consensus is, let's do a little backtracking first. 1986, Nintendo releases the first game in the Zelda franchise, simply titled The Legend of Zelda. The game itself barely showcased any story at all, except for a very brief introduction text which can only be seen if you leave the title screen on idle for about 10 seconds. The only other piece of story exposition was saved for the game's manual. 2 whole pages, in fact. By the way, great choice of text color and background, guys. I guess this was before readability became a thing. Anyway, back then there were only 2 Triforce pieces, Power and Wisdom. Power being in the possession of Ganon, and Wisdom having been separated into 8 pieces and hidden across Hyrule by Zelda. Nowhere does it ever state that a 3rd Triforce piece exists. It just says, The Legend of the Triforce, golden triangles possessing mystical powers. And on page 10 it reads, Link has destroyed Ganon and has managed to rescue Princess Zelda. Now that he's got a hold of the 2 Triforces, he once again goes on his travels towards countries unknown. Notice also how they use the word Triforces plural to describe the 2 triangles. Nowadays they usually don't do that anymore, and all 3 pieces combined are referred to as the Triforce, whereas individually they are either called a Triforce piece or simply by their virtue, like Triforce of Power or Triforce of Wisdom. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, the Japanese version is almost identical. The biggest difference being that here it's not the legend of the Triforces that's being passed down, but the objects themselves. What followed was Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. This game shows the first depiction of the Triforce symbol as we know it today, but not in the actual game itself, oh no. It barely misses the mark on that one. The only time we see it as one entity is, again, in the game's manual, and not even the relic itself, but in the form of a mark on the back of Link's hand. This is the first time that a 3rd piece of the Triforce is mentioned, and obtaining it is the main goal of the story. But as said before, the 3 pieces never combine into a single entity in-game and remain disconnected from each other. Then came A Link to the Past, and the first time we see the Triforce in its full glory. Suddenly, the symbol as we know it today was all over the place. As soon as you boot up the game, the logo, prologue, on shields, statues, in the ending cutscene, and of course in the manual. It's also here that we see the first iteration of a backstory for the Triforce. In Zelda 1 and 2 this was never touched upon. It just said it had mystical powers, but didn't explain where they came from or what these powers are exactly. A Link to the Past essentially cemented the Triforce as the 3-part wish-granting, all-powerful relic created by the gods we are all familiar with. And from here on out this narrative would largely remain the same, with some extra lore being added here and there. So with that said, what is the main consensus when it comes to the inspiration behind the Triforce? Well, in a nutshell, its origin can be traced back to the family crest or Mon from the Hojo clan. It's a family that played a crucial role in medieval Japan, most famous for their successful opposition to the Mongol invasions of Japan and fostering Zen Buddhism across the country. The crest itself originates from a legend, where the head of the family, Tokimasa Hojo, went to visit a dragon deity on the island of Inoshima to pray for the prosperity of his descendants. The dragon answered and left behind 3 scales, which together formed the Mitsuroko, which translates to 3 scales. This legend may have also been the inspiration for the 3 dragons in Breath of the Wild, as they too leave behind a scale, but I digress. Up until the Zelda series brought the Triforce into our pop culture, the symbol of the Mitsuroko was relatively obscure in the West, but in Japan it has persisted for centuries. Many families adapted a similar symbol as their crest, and it can still be found in Japanese graveyards today, including the grave of Gunpei Yokoi, inventor of the original Game Boy, who tragically died in a car accident in 1997. He's also described as having been a mentor for Shigeru Miyamoto, the visionary for Super Mario and the Zelda series. This has caused some to believe that the inclusion of the Triforce symbol was an homage to his mentor, who would have still been alive at that point, as he died only a mere month before the release of Ocarina of Time. There's also an important deity named Benzaiten, who serves as both a Buddhist goddess as well as a Shinto kami. There are multiple shrines devoted to her, including in and around the city of Kyoto, some of which depict a Triforce-like symbol as well, and Miyamoto has expressed that he likes to visit these kinds of shrines. Aside from that, the Mitsuroko is also found in the corporate world, like the Japanese energy company Mitsuroko. So yeah, Miyamoto would have no doubt been well aware of the existence of this icon, as it's part of Japanese culture and history. But as far as I'm aware, he's never publicly stated whether he took the inspiration straight from the history of the Hojo family, or if it was an homage to Yokoi's family crest, or if he just simply looked at his energy bill one day and was like, yes! Either way, it doesn't really matter, as ultimately it all links back to the Hojo legend. Some claim he did make a statement about it, and if that's the case, please provide me with a source. I have looked everywhere and I cannot find it. So given all I've just outlined, I think it's safe to say that yes, the Mitsuroko was most likely the inspiration for the Triforce as we know it today. Case closed, right? Well, here's the thing though. While it does explain why the Triforce looks the way it does now, is this really the true origin of the relic? Because remember, the Triforce didn't show up until Zelda 2's manual, and didn't make a full-on appearance in-game until A Link to the Past. If the idea for the Triforce was always there and based on the Mitsuroko symbol, why was it completely absent from the first Zelda? And not just from the game itself, but promotional art, commercials, and anything else related to the game. Well, I believe that initially there may have been a different inspiration for the Triforce, one that would later be changed as the series continued. Let me demonstrate what I mean. Although the Zelda series was created in Japan and by a Japanese company, it's become obvious that the series was initially inspired by a lot of Western ideas and catered towards a Western audience. We can see this fact pop up again and again in the game itself, artwork, interviews with the series creators, and even the music. The first and obvious one that most people know by now is that the name of the princess, as well as the series as a whole, is named after American writer and painter Zelda Fitzgerald, because Miyamoto thought the name sounded elegant. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. In the NES original, the Book of Magic resembles a standard depiction of the Holy Book of Christianity, the Bible, with a cross on the cover. And in the Japanese version of the game, the Book of Magic is literally called Bible. Furthermore, we find many cross symbolism on shields, enemies, and graves all throughout the first two games. And Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, even sees the cross as a quest item. It allows Link to see enemies which appear as invisible without it, and navigate the Valley of Death, another clear reference to the Christian faith. This also applies to Ganon himself. Nowadays, he's mostly described as the Demon King or King of Evil or something along those lines. But back then, he was referred to as the Prince of Darkness, which is one of many titles commonly used to address the devil. What's weird is that they didn't censor this in the opening crawl, but did remove it in some parts of the manual for some reason. Even Hyrule itself, its culture and architecture is confirmed to be based on medieval Europe, as stated by Hidemaru Fujibayashi. The opening title music of the first game was originally supposed to be an 8-bit rendition of a classical song called Bolero by French composer Maurice Ravel. However, right before the release of Zelda 1, it turned out that the song was still copyrighted, and thus the series composer Koji Kondo pulled an all-nighter to compose an original song, which came to be the iconic Zelda theme we all know and love. During an interview to celebrate the release of the NES Classic, Miyamoto even made the remark that at the time the song reminded him of spaghetti western movies. Speaking of Miyamoto, in the same interview he was also asked why he decided to make the Legend of Zelda series at the time, and his answer was simply, the Indiana Jones movies were out at the time, and continues on to say that he wanted to bring that sense of adventure to a video game. If you know anything about the Indiana Jones movies, you know that it features a lot of Western mythology, particularly Christianity, like the Ark of the Covenant, the Cross of Coronado, the Holy Grail, and so on. Basically what I'm saying is that Miyamoto has since the beginning of his career been inspired by these kinds of themes. And the same goes for Takashi Tezuka. He is, I guess, one of the lesser known figures from the Zelda development history, but equally as important, as he was the director and is considered to be the father of the Zelda storyline in the early 2D era. Prior to Zelda, he and Miyamoto made a game called Devil World, which was never released in the US, for obvious reasons. It too features holy crosses and, well, the devil. Safe to say that the two were definitely no stranger to taking inspiration from this kind of subject matter. It's actually a bit ironic if you think about it. Nintendo tried to appeal to a Western audience by putting in all sorts of references to their most prominent religion, but it sort of had the opposite effect, and a lot of it ended up getting censored to avoid controversy. Even to this day, Nintendo of America still removes or changes certain words or phrases, especially things regarding demons or the demon tribe. Check out this video by QuestWithAaron if you want to see just how much the English translation differs in some cases. Nowadays, a lot of people refer to Shintoism as one of the more prominent influences for the series lore, but that didn't really start becoming a noticeable thing until later, which is why I find it a bit difficult to believe that the Triforce was always meant to be based on Japanese mythology, even though almost everything else was clearly based on Christianity to some degree. There aren't a lot of quotes from the game's developers about the Triforce in the NES era, though Miyamoto has revealed one interesting thing about it since, namely that the original Zelda was supposed to feature elements of science fiction. The pieces of the Triforce Link collects were meant to be microchips, and Link would travel between the past and the future, and not like Ocarina of Time and its 7-year time gap, but like the Matrix type of future. And he closes by saying, but in the end Link never went to the future and it remained a heroic fantasy game. We can even say that there was absolutely nothing futuristic. Another example of the uncertainty that existed back in the late 80s regarding what exactly the Triforce was supposed to be is found in the Legend of Zelda cartoon from 1998. Of course, this isn't canon to the series lore, but it is obvious that the creators of the show tried to interpret and adapt as much of the original source material as they possibly could, from Link's abilities to the sound effects, the enemies, Ganon, etc. And when it comes to the Triforce, you can see that there wasn't really a good understanding yet regarding its origin, abilities, and overall lore. Here too, only two parts of the Triforce exist, one in Zelda's possession and one in the hands of Ganon, similar to the first game, and the entire plot revolves around Ganon trying to get his hands on both and conquer Hyrule. They don't resemble anything close to the modern day Triforce at all, and are instead upside down pyramids and possess the power of speech. It's also worth mentioning that although the series was made and published by a third party, it was overseen by Nintendo of America. So let's say the first iteration of the Triforce wasn't based on the Hojo legend and the Mitsuroko symbolism. Then what's the alternative? Given the track record of influences from Christianity in the early games, I'd say this might apply to the Triforce as well. Obviously, I cannot prove anything since there are simply no sources to fall back on, but my best guess is that it may have been based on the equilateral triangle, a symbol associated with the Holy Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I do have to mention that this depiction isn't universal throughout all of Christianity, and not all depictions of this are still accepted today. It kinda depends on who you ask and which branch of Christianity you would use as a reference. But in some cases, imagery of one or more golden triangles are used to represent the Trinity. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that someone from the original Zelda team, whether it was Miyamoto or Tezuka, took inspiration from these depictions. It would fall in line with all the other Christian references, and the Triforce was sort of a godlike relic with mystical powers. A more boring alternative would be that the Triforce took on the shape of a yellow triangle because it was simply an easy shape to use, given the graphical limitations at the time. I mean, there's only so many primitives you can choose from, so maybe it was just a random choice, which coincidentally fit well with the later ideas behind the Triforce. One could of course make the case that Nintendo chose a triangle because they were always planning to someday merge three of them together to form the Mitsuroko symbol, which is possible. The original creators were hoping that they could continue the series after the first game, but at the same time I just don't see Nintendo planning a roadmap that far ahead. I mean, the Zelda timeline is kind of a testament to that, especially considering they couldn't have known how big and successful the Zelda series would become in the future. The original lore was vague and lacked a lot of exposition and backstory. If there was an elaborate plan for the series lore at this point, I would honestly be very impressed. As the series progressed, Nintendo slowly slowly started doing away with a lot of real-life religious references in favor of their own original lore, as well as elements from Japanese mythology. This became especially noticeable with Skyward Sword and recently Breath of the Wild. And it's definitely not an uncommon thing to do. As an example, Miyazaki also started his career being heavily inspired by European architecture and settings, only to bring in more and more Japanese influences later on. Zelda was intended to be a classic medieval adventure story with a lot of inspiration from Western mythology and religion, but slowly veered off into its own direction as it became increasingly successful. Of course, everything we've discussed here today is in regards to the aesthetics of the Triforce. When it comes to its actual inner workings and mythology, well, that is a whole different story altogether. There's definitely a lot to explore here as well, but that's too big for one video, and perhaps I will dig into this as well someday. As always, I highly encourage a good and healthy discussion in the comments below. If you have your own ideas or found interesting details about the subject, don't shy away from sharing them with me and others. Or if you're just here to chime in about anything else Zelda related, or just here to say hi, that is of course more than welcome too. A big thanks to you for watching, to my mods both on Discord and my streams, and of course to my Patreons and channel members who remain ever so generous. Oh, and apparently my channel has been blessed with a new beta functionality which allows you to make a one-time donation, a bit like a super chat but for an individual video. So if you want to support the channel financially but you don't want to commit to a membership, this is a nice alternative, though never feel obligated to do so. Your support as a viewer is already greatly appreciated. And that is all for now. This is Dawn signing off, and have a good one.